On the morning of Saturday, March 7th, 2026, President Masoud Pezeshkian of the Islamic Republic of Iran sat down in front of a camera and did something that no Iranian head of government has done in 47 years of the Islamic Republic's existence. He apologized. Not for a minor diplomatic misstep, not for a misinterpreted statement that could be walked back with a clarification. He apologized, publicly, formally on state television, in a pre-recorded address that had clearly been reviewed, approved, and distributed to broadcasting infrastructure before anyone outside the Provisional Leadership Council knew it was coming, for military strikes conducted by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps against neighboring sovereign states. He apologized to the Gulf states. He announced a unilateral halt to attacks on neighbors. And then he said something that will be studied in political science courses for decades. He suggested that since the death of the Supreme Leader, the IRGC has been firing missiles without central authorization. He called his own military rogue. In the hours that followed, the Islamic Republic of Iran did something it has never done in its history. It demonstrated, live in real time on the record, that its civilian government and its military are operating in direct, open contradiction of each other. The IRGC's response was not a statement. It was not a press conference. It was not a leaked memos or an anonymous briefing to a sympathetic journalist. It was missiles. Hours after Pezeshkian's apology, the IRGC launched fresh strikes against Dubai Airport and the Jufair Naval Base in Bahrain, the headquarters of the United States Fifth Fleet. Read that again. The president of Iran apologizes for missile strikes and promises they will stop. The military then conducts new missile strikes against a Gulf city and a U.S. naval headquarters within hours. This is not a policy disagreement. This is not a political rift. This is the visible, public, operational fracturing of the Islamic Republic's command and control architecture at the exact moment when that architecture is under maximum external pressure from three directions simultaneously. And sitting in Washington, watching all of this happen, Donald Trump did what Donald Trump does. He pulled the thread. Welcome to Part 5 of the Iran Crisis series. This is the episode we hoped we would not need to make, because the scenario it describes is the scenario that the most pessimistic analysts had placed at the low end of their probability assessments. The Islamic Republic of Iran is not collapsing from external pressure. It is tearing itself apart from within. And the question that will define the next 72 hours is whether what we are witnessing is a manageable internal power struggle, one that revolutionary states have survived before, or whether it is the beginning of something that the Islamic Republic, in its current form, does not survive. The apology. What Pezeshkian actually did and why. To understand the full significance of what Pezeshkian did on March 7th, you need to understand three things simultaneously: what he said, what authority he was claiming when he said it, and what he was attempting to achieve strategically. Because this was not an impulsive statement. This was not a president speaking off script in a moment of frustration or grief. This was a pre-recorded, nationally broadcast address, the kind of communication that in any government requires preparation, legal review, and institutional sign-off. Pezeshkian did not make this speech by accident. He made it deliberately, knowing exactly what the IRGC's response would be, and he made it anyway. The three things Pezeshkian said. The address contained three distinct claims, each more consequential than the last, and it is important to separate them analytically because they operate on different levels of the Iranian political and legal system. The first claim was the apology itself, the statement that the Islamic Republic regrets the IRGC missile and drone strikes on Gulf state territory, and that these strikes did not reflect the policy of the government of the Islamic Republic. In international diplomatic terms, this is a formal acknowledgement of state responsibility combined with a repudiation of the actions taken. It is the kind of statement that Gulf foreign ministries will read very carefully because it potentially opens channels for diplomatic normalization that the IRGC's military posture has kept closed. The second claim was the policy announcement. The Provisional Leadership Council, the three-person interim governing body that Pezeshkian heads as president, alongside the Judiciary Chief and the Guardian Council representative, has approved a motion to halt all attacks on neighboring states, with the stated condition that those states do not permit their soil or airspace to be used as platforms for American or Israeli strikes against Iran. The third claim, the most explosive, the most consequential, and the most irreversible, was the characterization of the IRGC's recent military actions as occurring without central authorization. Pezeshkian stopped short of using the word rogue. He used the phrase acting at their own discretion. In the context of a formal presidential address, the distinction is largely semantic. He was saying, we did not order these strikes. The military conducted them without political authorization. The government of Iran is not responsible for the military of Iran. That statement is not something you can unsay. Why Pezeshkian did it. The strategic calculation. Pezeshkian's apology was not primarily addressed to the Gulf states, though they are its immediate diplomatic beneficiary. It was addressed to three specific audiences whose calculations it was designed to change. Audience 1, the United States. Trump's 10-day clock is running. The carrier group is in deterrence posture. The administration has explicitly stated that a hardline succession will trigger active regime replacement operations. Pezeshkian's speech is, in part, a direct communication to Washington. There is a faction of the Iranian government that is not the IRGC. There's a political leadership that is willing to take concrete steps, publicly, at enormous domestic political cost, toward the kind of de-escalation that Washington says it wants. Do not conflate the Islamic Republic with the Revolutionary Guard. Deal with us, not them. Audience 2, the Gulf states and the broader international community. The IRGC's strikes on Gulf territory have been a consistent obstacle to any diplomatic normalization of Iran's regional position. By apologizing publicly and announcing a halt, Pezeshkian is attempting to create a diplomatic opening that bypasses the IRGC entirely, to establish direct government-to-government relationships with Gulf states that do not route through the military and that therefore cannot be vetoed by IRGC commanders. Audience 3, the Iranian public. The population of Iran has been living under the consequences of the IRGC's regional military campaign in the form of retaliatory sanctions, economic deterioration, the constant threat of military escalation for years. Pezeshkian won the presidency precisely because Iranians wanted a different direction. His apology is a public demonstration that he is attempting to deliver on that promise, even against the resistance of the most powerful armed institution in the country. It is a statement of political identity as much as it is a diplomatic move. The strategic calculation behind the speech is coherent. Its flaw is that it assumes the IRGC will respond with institutional restraint, that when faced with a public presidential repudiation, the Guard will engage through political channels rather than through missiles. The IRGC responded with missiles. The Mosaic Defense Doctrine, what the IRGC is claiming. The IRGC's justification for continuing to conduct strikes after Pezeshkian's explicit halt order is not simply defiance. It is a doctrine, and doctrines in institutional militaries are more dangerous than individual acts of insubordination because they provide a framework within which unlimited insubordination can be retrospectively legitimized. The doctrine the IRGC is now invoking is called Mosaic Defense, an operational framework developed in Iranian military thinking over the past decade and a half as a response to the specific threat of decapitation strikes. The core logic is straightforward. If an adversary is capable of targeting the Islamic Republic's central command structure, and the Israeli and American military has demonstrated repeatedly that it is, then the Islamic Republic's military effectiveness cannot be dependent on that central command structure surviving. In Mosaic Defense, the military is organized as a distributed network of semi-autonomous combat nodes, regional commanders, unit commanders, specialty force commanders, each of which retains the authority and the capability to conduct offensive and defensive operations independently if communications with the central command are severed. The mosaic metaphor is deliberate. Remove one tile and the picture is damaged, but it does not cease to exist. The IRGC's commanders are now applying this doctrine not to a scenario where central command has been physically destroyed, it has not been, but to a scenario where central command has, in their judgment, been politically compromised. Pezeshkian's presidency, in the IRGC's institutional calculus, represents a form of political decapitation, the replacement of the revolutionary military security logic of the Islamic Republic with a reformist political logic that the Guard regards as fundamentally incompatible with the state's survival. By invoking Mosaic Defense in response to a presidential order, the IRGC is not merely defying Pezeshkian. It is making a constitutional claim that the survival of the Islamic Republic's military posture supersedes the authority of a provisional civilian government, that the Guard does not regard as legitimate. It is simultaneously a military doctrine, a political argument, and an institutional coup conducted without a single soldier moving against the presidential palace. The defiant strike. Dubai, Bahrain, and the point of no return. Let us be precise about what the IRGC did on March 7th, and let us be precise about what it means, because the language of crisis coverage can obscure the specific gravity of specific actions. The IRGC conducted ballistic missile and drone strikes against Dubai International Airport and the Jufair Naval Base in Manama, Bahrain. Dubai International Airport is the busiest airport in the world by international passenger traffic. On any given day, it handles over 200,000 passengers. A strike on Dubai Airport is not a military operation against a military target. It is an act of economic warfare against the global aviation and commercial infrastructure of the Gulf, with direct and immediate consequences for the civilian populations of every country that routes passengers and cargo through Dubai. Jufair Naval Base in Bahrain is the home of the United States Navy's Fifth Fleet, the operational command responsible for naval forces in the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, the Gulf of Oman, the Arabian Sea, and adjacent waters. Striking Jafar is not a strike on a Gulf state. It is a strike on the United States military. It is an act of war against the United States Navy, conducted under the flag of the Islamic Republic of Iran, hours after the President of the Islamic Republic announced a halt to military operations. The IRGC struck an American military base. The Iranian president had just announced a halt to strikes. The IRGC ignored the president and struck an American military base. I want to be analytically precise here because it matters. This is not ambiguous. This is not a situation where different interpretations of events lead to different conclusions. The IRGC conducted a military operation directly contradicting a presidential order against a target that constitutes an act of war against the United States. In any other country, in any other context, this would be called a military coup. In the Islamic Republic, in the current moment, it is being called the Mosaic Defense. The targets: why Dubai and Bahrain. The selection of Dubai Airport and Jafar Naval Base as targets is not random. It reflects a specific IRGC's strategic logic that is coherent, even if the timing and the defiance of presidential authority makes it politically catastrophic for the Islamic Republic's institutional coherence. Dubai is the economic hub through which Iran has conducted a significant portion of its sanctions, circumvention trade for decades. Iranian goods and financial flows have moved through Dubai's free zones, its banking system, and its commercial infrastructure through layers of front companies and intermediary relationships. By striking Dubai Airport, the IRGC is sending a message to the UAE government that has multiple layers: that the Guard is not constrained by the presidential apology, that the UAE's position in the current crisis matters to the IRGC's strategic calculations, and that the cost of accommodating American and Israeli pressure, which the UAE has been quietly doing through intelligence sharing and basing arrangements, will be demonstrated in kinetic terms rather than diplomatic ones. Jafar Naval Base is simpler and more alarming. It is the home of the Fifth Fleet. Striking it is the IRGC's answer to Trump's 10-day clock, to the carrier group's deterrence posture, and to Pezeshkian's apology simultaneously. It is the Guard saying, "We are not deterred. We do not accept the civilian government's authority over military operations, and we will demonstrate both of those positions by striking the American military headquarters in the Gulf." The operational effectiveness of the strikes, how many missiles were fired, what physical damage was caused, what military capability was degraded, is secondary to the political and strategic signal. The IRGC is not primarily trying to destroy the Fifth Fleet. It is trying to establish, in the most definitive possible terms, that it operates independently of both the civilian government and the deterrent threat posed by American military power. The hardliner response: Pezeshkian under siege. The domestic political response to Pezeshkian's speech was immediate, coordinated, and vicious. Hamid Rasai, one of the most prominent hardline clerics in the current Assembly of Experts, a figure deeply aligned with the IRGC's political interests, issued a public statement on social media that characterized Pezeshkian's address as unprofessional and weak. The specific language Rasai chose is significant. Unprofessional and weak are not theological criticisms. They are IRGC institutional language for a civilian official who has failed to understand the security requirements of the moment. Rasai is not speaking as a cleric. He is speaking as a political arm of the Guard. That final line, "The Assembly of Experts must act immediately," is the operational core of the hardliner response. It is a direct call for the Assembly to accelerate the Supreme Leader selection and thereby eliminate the constitutional basis for Pezeshkian's authority over the armed forces. The logic is precise. Pezeshkian's authority to claim command of the IRGC rests on his position as head of the Provisional Leadership Council under Article 111. The Provisional Leadership Council's authority exists only because there is no Supreme Leader. If the Assembly of Experts elects a Supreme Leader, even one the hardliners want, specifically Masoud Khamenei, the Provisional Leadership Council is dissolved, Pezeshkian loses his constitutional claim to military command, and the IRGC reverts to Supreme Leader authority, which is the authority it has always preferred. The hardliner strategy is therefore elegantly simple. Use Pezeshkian's apology as the political justification for accelerating the Supreme Leader selection, install Mojtaba within 24 hours, dissolve the council, and end the constitutional basis for civilian command of the IRGC in a single procedural move. The Trump factor: how Washington is weaponizing the chaos. Donald Trump has spent the past week creating the conditions for exactly this kind of internal Iranian fracture. The question now is whether he understands the difference between a fracture that accelerates regime change on American terms and a fracture that produces a kinetic escalation that no one can control. Based on his public statements as of March 8th, the honest answer is that it is not entirely clear that he or his administration has fully thought through the distinction. The exchange: surrender to the grave. This is analytically wrong and strategically counterproductive. But understanding why it is wrong requires understanding what the apology actually represented, which we covered in segment 2. Pezeshkian's apology was not a surrender. It was a political gambit, a high-risk attempt by a reform-aligned civilian president to use the succession crisis as an opportunity to reorient Iranian foreign policy in a direction that serves both Iranian civilian interests and creates the diplomatic space for de-escalation with Washington. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of move that the Venezuela model was designed to encourage. An internal Iranian actor taking concrete steps toward the outcome the United States says it wants. By calling it a surrender and demanding unconditional capitulation, Trump closed the diplomatic door that Pezeshkian had just opened, and gave the IRGC exactly the talking point it needed to argue that engagement with the West is futile, that reformists who try to negotiate are humiliated rather than rewarded, and that the only language Washington understands is the language of force. Pezeshkian's response deserves more analytical attention than it has received, because it is simultaneously a defiance of Trump and a veiled critique of the IRGC. When he says we are not the Iran that the IRGC is showing the world today, he is publicly distinguishing the civilian government of Iran from the military's actions, in a presidential statement on the record. He is continuing to drive the wedge he opened with the apology, now using Trump's maximalism as additional justification for why the civilian government represents a different Iranian future. The problem is that Pezeshkian is making this argument in an environment where the IRGC has just struck an American military base and Trump has promised that Iran will be hit hard. The diplomatic space for Pezeshkian's argument is shrinking with every missile that the IRGC fires and every bomb that Trump promises. The hit, hard promise. What does it mean operationally? Trump's statement that Iran will be hit very hard on March 8th is the kind of public commitment that creates its own operational pressure. Having said it publicly, the administration faces a credibility cost if it does not follow through, and a potentially catastrophic escalation cost if it does follow through without a clear end state in mind. The Iranian target, set available to U.S. military planners, falls into several categories. And the category that is chosen will tell you everything about whether the Trump administration is executing a coercive deterrent strategy or a genuine military campaign. Category 1, IRGC infrastructure. Missile storage facilities, launch sites, command and control nodes, logistics networks. Strikes in this category are designed to degrade the IRGC's operational capability without threatening the survival of the Iranian state. They are the military equivalent of the presidential apology. Targeted, limited, designed to create conditions for de-escalation rather than unconditional victory. They are also the category most likely to be perceived by the IRGC as an existential threat requiring maximum retaliation. Category 2, nuclear infrastructure. The enrichment facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, the heavy water reactor at Arak, the uranium conversion facility at Isfahan. Strikes in this category would achieve one of Trump's stated strategic objectives, eliminating the Iranian nuclear weapons pathway, but at the cost of triggering the most severe possible Iranian retaliation, almost certain Hormuz closure, and a regional escalation that would likely involve Hezbollah, the Houthis, and every PMF faction in Iraq simultaneously. Category 3, leadership targets. IRGC commanders Mojtaba Khamenei, the members of the Assembly of Experts who are pushing for his installation. This is the Venezuela model's kinetic dimension, the use of targeted elimination to reshape the political succession outcome. It is also the category most likely to unify Iranians across factional lines behind the IRGC, discredit Pezeshkian's de-escalation strategy, and transform a manageable internal political conflict into a nationalist war of survival. The administration's public messaging, hit hard, does not specify the category. That ambiguity may be intentional coercive signaling, or it may be an administration that has not yet decided. The window of opportunity and its closing. Here is the strategic reality that both the Trump administration and the Iranian civilian government are operating within, whether or not either side is fully articulating it. The Pezeshkian apology created the narrowest possible window for a negotiated off-ramp from the current crisis. A civilian Iranian government that has publicly repudiated IRGC unauthorized strikes, apologized to Gulf states, and announced a halt to military operations against neighbors, is, by the standards of anything Washington has seen from Tehran in 47 years, an unprecedented opening. That window closes in direct proportion to the escalation of military action. Every U.S. strike on Iranian territory strengthens the IRGC's internal argument that Pezeshkian's conciliation strategy is naive and suicidal. Every Iranian retaliation for U.S. strikes strengthens Washington's argument that there is no meaningful distinction between the civilian government and the IRGC. Every exchange of fire makes the negotiated pathway harder to walk. Trump's promise to hit Iran hard on March 8th, the same day Pezeshkian issued his apology, is either a deliberate decision to close that window or a failure to recognize that it existed. The outcome of the next 48 hours will tell us which. Conclusion: the Republic's last chance and the 48-hour test. We are in the most dangerous 48 hours in the history of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Not the most dangerous 48 hours in the history of the Iranian-American confrontation, though it is certainly that too. The most dangerous 48 hours in the history of the Islamic Republic itself. Because what is happening right now is not a conflict between Iran and America. It is a conflict between two visions of what Iran is. And the outcome of that internal conflict will determine whether the external conflict escalates to catastrophic levels or finds the narrow path to something else. Let me give you the framework for the next 48 hours. 3 tests that will tell us which Iran prevails. The 3 tests. Test 1. Does the IRGC conduct additional strikes after Trump's promised military action? If the IRGC launches further offensive operations against Gulf states, against U.S. assets, against any external target, in the 48 hours following whatever the U.S. does on March 8th, it has conclusively demonstrated that neither presidential orders nor external military deterrence can constrain its operations. The Mosaic Defense Doctrine will be de facto operational reality. Pezeshkian's authority will be functionally over, and the Islamic Republic will be, for all practical purposes, governed by its military rather than its constitutional framework. Test 2. Does the Assembly of Experts accelerate the Mojtaba announcement? If the hardliner pressure campaign succeeds and the Assembly announces a new Supreme Leader, specifically Masoud Khamenei, within the 24-hour window that Rasai and the hardliners have called for, the Provisional Leadership Council is dissolved, Pezeshkian loses his constitutional basis for military command, and the IRGC's strategy of forcing the succession to marginalize civilian authority succeeds. At that point, Washington's choice is binary. Accept the succession and abandon the 10-day clock framework, or treat the announcement as the trigger for active regime replacement operations. Test 3. Does Pezeshkian survive politically? This is the least militarily dramatic test, but the most strategically significant. If Pezeshkian maintains the support of enough institutional actors, moderate clerics, pragmatist political class, the Iranian public, potentially the Larijani faction, to continue making his case for a different Iranian direction, the internal struggle remains live. A Pezeshkian who is still standing after the IRGC defiance in the US strikes as a Pezeshkian who might still be the pivot point for the outcome the United States says it wants. His political survival is not guaranteed. He is under enormous pressure from every direction simultaneously. But his survival is the prerequisite for any scenario other than Scenario 2 or Scenario 3 from last episode. I want to leave you with the frame that I think matters most in this moment, because in the noise of breaking developments, it is easy to lose the signal. Masoud Pezeshkian stood in front of a camera on March 7th and said something that every president of the Islamic Republic since 1979 has known was true, but none have been willing to say publicly, that the military has been operating outside the boundaries of civilian authorization. He said it knowing the IRGC would respond with more missiles. He said it knowing that the hardliners would immediately try to use it to accelerate his marginalization. He said it anyway. Because the alternative, silence, complicity, the continuation of a trajectory that every serious analyst has assessed leads to war, was worse than the political cost of speaking. Whether that act of political courage becomes the turning point in this crisis, or whether it becomes a footnote in the history of the Islamic Republic's collapse, depends entirely on what happens in the next 48 hours. The IRGC is betting that force is the only language that matters. Pezeshkian is betting that there is still a version of Iran that can choose something different. Trump is betting that chaos accelerates the outcome he wants. One of them is right. We will know which one very soon. Iran is not just fighting the world right now. It is fighting itself. And that fight, the one happening inside, between the men in suits and the men in uniforms, may be the most important one. Stay with us.